When Barron Trump stepped onto the famed Stanford University stage, the auditorium buzzed with tension and whispers. No one, not the skeptical faculty members, not the divided student body, and certainly not the critics who had mocked him for years, could have predicted how the next 60 minutes would completely transform their perception of the former president's son. But before I reveal what happened next, let me take you inside that auditorium on what would become a watershed moment, not just for Barron, but for an entire generation of young voices. The circular amphitheater was packed to capacity, with over 500 attendees squeezed into every available seat. The air felt electric, almost suffocating with anticipation. You could practically taste the skepticism hanging in the room, metallic and sharp, like pennies on the tongue. The audience was a sea of crossed arms and furrowed brows, with only a scattered few showing open curiosity about what the 18-year-old Trump might have to say. If you're enjoying this breakdown of what happened that day, make sure to hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming coverage of other pivotal moments reshaping American dialogue. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. In the front row sat Dr. Elena Marquez, Stanford's celebrated professor of political science, whose scathing article, The Unearned Privilege of Political Offspring, had gone viral just weeks earlier. Though she never mentioned Barron by name, everyone knew who inspired her 3,000-word critique. Her posture now, rigid, arms folded tightly across her chest, lips pressed into a thin line, telegraphed her disbelief that the university had granted this platform to someone she considered nothing more than a beneficiary of nepotism. Beside her sat the event organizer, Professor James Hamilton, nervously adjusting his glasses every few seconds. He had faced intense backlash for extending the invitation, with faculty petitions demanding cancellation and student protests outside his office. But Hamilton held firm, arguing that diverse viewpoints deserved a hearing. Now, as the lights dimmed, he wondered if that decision would end his 30-year career. "Today's speaker needs little introduction," Hamilton began, his voice betraying slight tremors that the microphone amplified throughout the hall, though perhaps he deserves a more substantial one than the media has often provided. A few scattered chuckles broke the tension, followed immediately by several loud scoffs from the back of the room. As Hamilton continued his introduction, something unusual caught everyone's attention. Unlike most guest speakers who remained backstage until their grand entrance, Barron Trump was already seated at the edge of the stage. No entourage, no security detail visible to the audience, no flashy entrance. Just a tall, slender young man in a simple navy suit, watching the audience with calm, observant eyes. This subtle departure from protocol, this unexpected humility, created the first hairline fracture in the audience's unified skepticism. When Hamilton finished his introduction, Barron stood and approached the podium with measured steps. The tension in the room intensified as everyone leaned forward slightly, many preparing to document any stumble or gaffe for social media mockery. Barron adjusted the microphone. It had been set for someone much shorter, and for a brief moment, dead silence filled the room. What happened in the next few seconds would later be described as the perfect manipulation of audience psychology. Instead of beginning his speech immediately, Barron simply stood there, making unhurried eye contact with different sections of the audience. His face remained impassive, neither smiling to ingratiate himself, nor frowning to show displeasure at the palpable hostility. The silence stretched for 15 uncomfortable seconds. 15 seconds that felt like an eternity to an audience trained for constant stimulation. People shifted in their seats, coughed nervously, glanced at each other with uncertainty. Who would break first, the speaker or the audience? "I've read your work, Professor Marquez," Barron finally said, his voice deeper and more measured than anyone expected. He looked directly at the startled professor in the front row. "Your critique of inherited privilege raises important questions about meritocracy." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not the defensive opening anyone had anticipated. "In fact, it's one of the reasons I accepted Professor Hamilton's invitation, not to refute your assessment, but to engage with it." The first collective intake of breath was audible. Barron Trump had just acknowledged criticism without dismissing it. A move so unexpected that even Dr. Marquez uncrossed her arms, her expression shifting from dismissive to cautiously attentive. What defines merit in today's society? Who decides which voices deserve amplification? How should we balance opportunity against advantage? Barron continued, listing questions rather than making assertions. These aren't just academic concerns. They're questions I've wrestled with personally for as long as I can remember. As he moved into the substance of his speech, Barron did something that would later be analyzed by communication experts worldwide. He structured his address not as a defensive justification of his existence or his family name, but as an exploration of identity formation under the microscope of public judgment. Rather than a standard political speech, he delivered what could only be described as a thoughtful philosophical inquiry into the nature of individualism versus collective perception. Many of you came here today with preconceptions about who I am, he said, his voice remaining steady. Some based on my father, some on media narratives, some on partisan assumptions. I don't blame you for that. It's human nature to categorize, to sort information based on existing schemas. He paused, allowing the academic framing to register with the scholarly audience. But what happens when those schemas become prisons, not just for those being observed, but for the observers themselves? The audience's resistance was melting by the minute. Even those who had arrived ready to dismiss every word found themselves reluctantly engaged. Barron wasn't playing to their expectations. He wasn't defensive, wasn't privileged, wasn't unprepared. Instead, he was speaking their language, challenging them intellectually rather than emotionally. But the real turning point came 20 minutes into the speech when Barron addressed the elephant in the room, his family name. Yes, I was born into extraordinary privilege, he acknowledged, his tone neither apologetic nor proud. I've had opportunities most people will never have. Doors have opened because of my last name. I would be either dishonest or delusional to claim otherwise. A few audience members nodded in satisfaction, believing they were about to witness a concession that proved their point. Instead, what they got was something entirely unexpected. But a door being open isn't the same as knowing what to do once you walk through it, Barron continued. Having opportunities doesn't automatically confer the wisdom to use them well. And carrying a name that precedes you doesn't mean you understand who you are. The room grew so quiet you could hear the subtle buzz of the lighting system overhead. For most of my life, I've existed in the public imagination as an extension of someone else, a footnote in other people's narratives. I've been both weaponized and shielded, discussed and dismissed, all without any input from me. His voice remained even, but for the first time, a hint of genuine emotion colored his words. And while everyone was busy deciding who I was supposed to be, I was doing the work of figuring out who I actually am. Dr. Marquez, the once hostile professor, was now leaning forward, her notebook open but her pen motionless. What happened next would later be described in her own follow-up article as the moment symbolism gave way to substance. Barron reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is the first college essay I ever wrote, he said. It was rejected. Not because it was poorly written. The admissions officer actually sent a note saying it was one of the most compelling essays they'd read that year. It was rejected because the school feared that accepting me would be perceived as a political statement. He carefully unfolded the paper. I didn't write about politics. I didn't write about my father. I wrote about my interest in computational linguistics and how language processing algorithms might be improved to detect nuance in human communication. A sad smile briefly crossed his face. Ironic, isn't it, that an essay about understanding nuance was rejected because of binary thinking? The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Several students exchanged uncomfortable glances. A professor in the third row removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. The narrative was shifting, and everyone felt it. For the next 30 minutes, Barron delivered what can only be described as a masterclass in intellectual humility and rigorous self-reflection. He quoted not from conservative thinkers as many expected, but from a diverse range of philosophers across the political spectrum, from John Stuart Mill to Frantz Fanon, from Hannah Arendt to Cornel West. He wove together concepts of identity formation, epistemic justice, and the dangers of reducing complex individuals to one-dimensional caricatures. But the most powerful moment, the one that would be replayed millions of times online in the coming days, came during the Q&A session that followed. A student journalist stood, his question dripping with barely concealed contempt. Given your father's contentious relationship with academic institutions and expertise in general, how do you reconcile your presence at an elite university like Stanford? Isn't there hypocrisy in benefiting from the very institutions your family has undermined? The room tensed. This was the ambush everyone had been waiting for, the moment when Barron would either lose his composure or retreat into rehearsed talking points. Professor Hamilton half rose from his seat, prepared to intervene, but Barron raised a hand slightly, signaling he would answer. "That's an excellent question," Barron said, surprising everyone yet again with his lack of defensiveness. "And it highlights exactly what I've been discussing about the limitations of binary thinking." He stepped out from behind the podium for the first time, moving to the edge of the stage as if to reduce the distance between himself and his questioner. "You're operating from an assumption that families must be ideological monoliths, that a son must answer for or embody every position of his father." His voice remained respectful, but took on a new intensity. "But that assumption doesn't just diminish me, it diminishes you too. It reduces all of us to mere extensions of our parents, our parties, our demographic categories." The student journalist remained standing, but his confrontational posture had softened noticeably. "I'm not here to defend or criticize any specific policies," Barron continued. "I'm here because I believe universities should be places where ideas are engaged with on their merits, not their sources, where questions matter more than conclusions, where exploration isn't constrained by tribal loyalties." He paused, looking around the room before returning his gaze to the student. "And yes, I recognize the privilege of being able to say that. Many people don't get heard regardless of the merit of their ideas. That's a serious problem we should address. But the solution isn't to silence more voices. It's to amplify those that have been marginalized." The student journalist slowly sat down, his expression a complex mixture of surprise and reluctant respect. Around the room, something remarkable was happening. Professors known for their progressive politics were nodding in agreement with the son of Donald Trump. Dr. Marquez, who had begun the event as Barron's most visible critic, was the next to stand. The room hushed in anticipation of her question, which everyone expected would be the intellectual equivalent of a knockout punch. "Mr. Trump," she began, her tone measured but intense, "you've spoken eloquently about identity formation and the constraints of public perception. But you've avoided addressing how power operates in these dynamics. Given your family's significant influence, do you acknowledge how that power has shaped not just opportunities available to you, but the very conditions under which public discourse occurs?" It was a sophisticated challenge, not a gotcha question, but a genuinely difficult philosophical problem. Barron didn't answer immediately. For the first time in his presentation, he took a moment to consider, and that visible thinking, that refusal to rush to a ready-made response, earned him more credibility than any quick retort could have. "You're absolutely right to bring power into this discussion," he finally said. "Any analysis that ignores power differentials is incomplete at best and deceptive at worst." He took a deep breath. "My family name comes with remarkable privilege and power, financial, social, and political. That power has undoubtedly shaped my life in ways I'm still coming to understand, some obvious and some likely invisible even to me." He walked slowly across the stage, gathering his thoughts. "But power isn't monolithic either. My last name opens certain doors while simultaneously closing others. It grants certain platforms while restricting access to others. It amplifies my voice in some contexts while ensuring I won't be heard in others." Dr. Marquez was listening intently, her expression inscrutable. "The more important question," Barron continued, "is what responsibility comes with whatever power one possesses. And that's something I think about constantly. How do I use the platforms I have access to? How do I acknowledge the advantages I've received while not being defined solely by them? How do I contribute something meaningful rather than simply occupying space others might use more wisely?" His voice grew stronger, more passionate, though still thoughtful. "I don't have perfect answers to these questions, but I believe wrestling with them openly is more valuable than pretending power dynamics don't exist or that I'm somehow exempt from them." Dr. Marquez nodded slowly, making a note in her book before sitting down. Whatever she had expected from this exchange, it clearly wasn't this. The entire audience seemed to be recalibrating their assessment, not just of Barron Trump, but of their own preconceptions. As the event drew to a close, Barron delivered the statement that would eventually be quoted in headlines across the political spectrum. We live in an age where certainty is valued over curiosity, where having the right opinions matters more than asking the right questions, he said, surveying the now attentive audience. We sort ourselves into intellectual enclaves where we never have to encounter ideas that challenge us. We dismiss people before they speak based on markers of identity or affiliation, and in doing so, we impoverish not just public discourse, but our own intellectual and moral development. He straightened his shoulders slightly, his voice gaining resonance. I'm not asking for special treatment or exemption from criticism. Quite the opposite. I'm asking for the same critical engagement you would give to any set of ideas. Judge me not by my last name, but by the substance of my thoughts. Challenge me not based on who you think I am, but on what I actually say and do. As he delivered his final lines, even those who had come determined to dismiss him were leaning forward in their seats. The greatest privilege I could ask for isn't protection from criticism. It's the privilege of being taken seriously enough to be criticized substantively rather than symbolically. It's the privilege of being seen as an individual with agency rather than a proxy for someone else's agenda. The silence that followed these words lasted for 3 full seconds, an eternity in public speaking. Then from the back of the room, a single person began to applaud. Others joined hesitantly at first, then with growing conviction, until the entire auditorium was filled with the sound of applause. It wasn't the partisan ovation of a campaign rally. It was the thoughtful appreciation of an audience whose expectations had been thoroughly upended. As Barron left the stage, Dr. Marcus rose and approached him. Their brief exchange wasn't captured by microphones, but observers reported seeing the professor hand Barron her card before they shook hands. Within hours, clips from the speech began circulating online. What made them so compelling wasn't just Barron's eloquence or composure. It was the visible transformation of the audience, particularly the skeptical academics who had arrived expecting to dismiss a privileged young man and instead encountered a thoughtful voice they couldn't ignore. The speech would go on to be viewed millions of times across platforms, analyzed in communication classes, and debated on political shows across the spectrum. Conservative media celebrated it as a victory, while progressive outlets grappled with how to respond to arguments that aligned with many of their core intellectual values coming from an unexpected source. 3 days later, Dr. Marquez published a follow-up to her viral article. Titled Beyond Binary Thinking, Reconsidering Merit in Public Discourse, it never explicitly retracted her earlier criticism, but acknowledged the limitations of her framework. The final paragraph read, "Perhaps the most important measure of privilege is not how many opportunities one receives, but what one chooses to do with them. By that standard, we would do well to evaluate each voice on its contribution rather than its provenance." For Barron Trump, the Stanford speech marked a turning point, not just in public perception, but in his own emergence as a distinct intellectual voice. He had arrived as Donald Trump's son and departed as Barron Trump, an individual with his own perspective and his own contribution to make. And for a nation mired in partisan polarization, the speech offered a glimpse of something many had forgotten was possible: a genuine exchange of ideas across the boundaries that typically divide us. In silencing his critics, Barron Trump had achieved something far more significant than winning an argument. He had changed the nature of the conversation itself. If you found this analysis valuable, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you in-depth coverage of pivotal moments shaping our national dialogue.